Hey, Sip and Talkers. It's your host, Joe, and with me as always, Sunny.
Hey, Joe. What's up?
I gotta tell you, my morning got off to a crazy start today.
Oh, no. What happened?
Well, I'm trying to, get back into running a little bit.
Oh, yeah. You were telling me about that.
I was, yeah. And so I'm out there, just doing my thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the squirrel's, I swear this squirrel must be training for, the Squirrel Olympics or something. It darted right out in front of me.
Yeah.
And I, nearly tripped over it.
Oh, my gosh.
My coffee went flying. It was a whole...
Oh, that's a disaster.
Well, it was a mess.
Yeah. I've been doing a lot of reading about, these big changes that seem to be happening in the global economy.
Yeah.
And, this is something that you and I have talked about a bit, and a lot of our listeners have been asking about, too. There's this growing idea that the U.S. really needs to kind of shift its focus and start putting America first.
Yeah.
And we're going to dive into that today.
Yeah, that's right. And, we've had a lot of questions about, what does America first even really mean?
Right.
And why is it such a big deal right now? So we're going to try to take a look at that today.
Yeah.
We're going to kind of unpack some of these arguments about how China has grown its economy so much.
Yeah.
And how, some people are saying that they've gotten ahead partly by acquiring technology.
Mm-hmm.
But, it's also important to remember that, every country is looking out for its own people, right?
Of course. Yeah. Every country's trying to do what's best for themselves.
Exactly.
Sure. Absolutely.
So it's kind of a complex situation.
It is. Yeah. It's not a simple issue.
No, not at all.
And to really understand this America First idea, we've been looking at some of the stuff that Marco Rubio has been saying recently.
Okay.
He's a senator who's been pretty vocal about his concerns about the history of trade between the U.S. and China and kind of what it means for us now.
Yeah.
And so his perspective is going to be a really important part of what we talk about today.
Okay, cool. So Rubio talks about this kind of old consensus that existed after World War II.
Right.
What was that all about?
So after World War II, there was this really strong belief that economic globalization would lead to a world where everybody was wealthier and everybody had more freedom, and there would be more peace.
So, if everyone's trading with each other, they're not going to fight each other kind of thing.
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
It was this idea that, trade promotes peace, and it promotes prosperity, and it promotes freedom. And this was a bipartisan belief.
Yeah.
This wasn't just one party saying this. This was both Democrats and Republicans agreed on this.
Interesting. So both sides of the aisle were all kind of on board with this.
Yeah, and for the first 50 years or so after World War II, it kind of seemed like it was working.
Yeah. I mean, I vaguely remember this being the kind of optimistic talk back then.
Yeah.
Things are going to be great. We're going to trade with each other, and it's all going to work out.
Yeah, exactly.
And Rubio makes this point that, the global market at that time was mainly democracies.
Right.
Those are allies.
Yeah, it was basically a club of countries that had pretty similar values.
Yeah.
And even if, the U.S. didn't get, the best deal in every single interaction.
Sure.
The benefits were going to other democracies who were often our allies in the Cold War anyway.
Right.
So it wasn't that big of a deal if we lost out a little bit here or there.
It's like trading with your friends.
Yeah, exactly.
Even if you get a slightly worse deal, it's okay, well, they're my friend.
Yeah, you're helping each other out.
Yeah.
And the fundamental interests of the global market and the U.S. weren't that different.
Right.
So it was seen as a win-win.
Okay, so fast forward then to the end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall comes down. Everyone's celebrating the Soviet Union's collapsing.
Yeah.
It seems like a new era.
Yeah, and that's when Rubio says that there was this kind of hubris. Almost like an overconfidence among leaders in both parties.
Okay.
And the thinking became that because capitalism had won the Cold War,
right,
that if you just opened up economies around the world, that it would automatically lead to political freedom as well.
So the thinking was if you just let countries embrace capitalism, they'll naturally become democracies.
Yeah, exactly. You sell them enough Coca-Cola and they'll want free elections.
Right. Gosh. Big Macs for democracy.
Yeah, Big Macs for democracy. That's a good slogan.
Like that.
But this was a very powerful idea at the time, and it led to a lot of, new trade agreements, new treaties, new rules for how the global economy was supposed to work.
Okay.
And it brought a lot of countries into this system that weren't democracies and didn't necessarily share American values.
Right. And that kind of leads us into the big one here.
Yeah.
China joining the WTO in 2001.
Right.
That was supposed to be this huge deal.
It was a really pivotal moment, yeah.
Right.
And the main argument at the time for letting China into the WTO was not that it was going to immediately create a bunch of jobs in America or boost American industries right away.
Right.
The argument was that capitalism would change China.
Okay.
The thinking was that as China's economy opened up, as people in China started to buy more Western goods, that they would inevitably want more political freedom as well.
Okay.
And that China would eventually become a democracy.
It's kind of like that trickle-down economics idea, but on a global scale.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. And of course, that's not what happened.
Right. Laughs.
No, that's not how things played out.
Big Macs didn't quite bring democracy to China.
No, the Big Macs didn't do it.
All right, so what happened instead?
Well, Rubio argues that instead of capitalism changing China, China changed capitalism.
Okay.
They opened up their doors and they attracted massive amounts of foreign investment by offering really cheap labor.
Right.
And the promise of a huge new market.
1 billion new customers.
Yeah, exactly. 1 billion new customers.
Yeah.
And so American companies, American money poured into China chasing profits and returns.
Right. And we saw, a lot of jobs and factories moving overseas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the story that we were told at the time was that, don't worry, those are just the low-paying jobs.
Right.
We'll have better, higher-skilled jobs here in the U.S.
Right.
The idea was that, manufacturing jobs that moved to China would be replaced by better-paying jobs in tech and services and all that.
Right. The future is in silicon, not steel kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that the growing middle class in China, with their new wealth, they were going to start buying American-made goods.
Right.
Which would boost the U.S. economy. And, of course, we also talked about the expectation that this would lead to political reforms within China.
Right.
But Rubio says, that didn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we can all pretty much see that at this point.
Yeah.
So what did happen? What does Rubio say were the consequences of this?
So Rubio points to several consequences. First, he talks about increased division within the U.S.
Okay.
And not just the usual political disagreements, but like a deeper divide between the people who benefited from this global economic shift.
Okay.
People in finance, people in big tech companies.
Okay.
Certain industries, people living in, thriving big cities.
Right.
Versus the millions of working class Americans who were left behind.
Right.
In communities where factories closed down.
Yeah, those better, higher skilled jobs didn't exactly materialize for a lot of folks.
Right. And people have lives, they have families, they have communities.
You can't just pick up and move across the country just like that.
Right, exactly. People have roots.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole thing about, we've kind of become addicted to cheap stuff from China.
Yeah, like we love our cheap electronics and our...
Right, exactly. And Rubio really emphasizes this point that, the U.S. has become really reliant on these cheap imports from China and dependent on Chinese supply chains for all sorts of things.
Right, everything.
Food, medicine, technology, I mean, you name it.
Right.
And the pandemic really highlighted this. When you depend on a geopolitical competitor for things that you absolutely need, it creates a real risk because they can use that against you.
Right. They have leverage over you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And what about the U.S. economy itself? He argues that the actual structure of our economy has changed.
Right. He argues that it's become really concentrated and fragile.
Okay.
Dominated by, these giant finance companies and big tech corporations. And that these companies often have more influence than the government itself.
Wow.
And that their primary loyalty isn't necessarily to the American people or to, the national interest.
Just to their shareholders.
Yeah, to their shareholders and their bottom line.
Right.
And he says that this idea that economic globalization would somehow prevent great power competition was a pipe dream. Yeah, it seems like a pretty naive idea in retrospect.
Yeah.
That somehow everyone's just going to be trading with each other and no one's going to want to, compete for power anymore.
Yeah, like we're all just going to be one big, happy global family.
Yeah.
No, it hasn't worked out that way.
And he points to places like Hong Kong and Taiwan and Ukraine as examples that free trade doesn't necessarily lead to peace.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So basically, China looked at the system that we created. They figured out how to play the game a little differently.
Right.
And they did what was best for them.
Yeah. And Rubio really emphasizes this point that, China took advantage of the benefits of the global system that the U.S. helped to create. But they didn't necessarily play by the same rules or share the same long-term goals.
They had their own agenda.
Yeah, they had their own agenda. And he's not, he's not trying to say that China's evil or anything like that. He's saying that they're acting rationally in their own national interest, which is what countries do. Right. So the point isn't to blame China. The point is for the U.S. to wake up and start, rethinking its own approach.
Right, to kind of learn from what happened and figure out, okay, what do we do now?
Exactly.
Okay, so a big part of China's economic growth has been, how they've acquired technology.
Right.
So how do they do that?
Well, the claim is that they used a lot of different methods.
Okay.
And this included things like pressuring foreign companies to form partnerships with Chinese companies as a condition for doing business in China.
So, like, if you want to sell your products in China, you have to partner with a local company.
Right. And then through these partnerships, Chinese companies were allegedly able to steal trade secrets and intellectual property.
And then once they had what they needed, they would just kick out the foreign companies.
Yeah, basically, they would learn what they needed, and then they would push out the foreign companies and take over the market themselves.
Wow, that's pretty cutthroat.
Yeah, it's a pretty aggressive strategy.
But is there any evidence to support this? Is this just like speculation, or do we have actual data?
So there is some pretty concerning data. The FBI has estimated that the U.S. economy loses somewhere between $225 billion and $600 billion every year.
Wow.
Due to intellectual property theft by China.
That's a huge number.
It's a massive number, yeah.
Okay.
And specific industries have been targeted. Aviation, artificial intelligence, pharmaceuticals, all sorts of things.
So they're going after like high-tech, cutting-edge stuff.
Yeah, exactly. They're going after the industries of the future.
Okay.
And there was this quote from Derek Scissors, who's from the American Enterprise Institute.
Okay.
He pointed out that this kind of intellectual property theft allows Chinese companies to basically skip the R&D process.
Right. You don't have to spend the time and the money to develop.
Exactly. And then they can just undercut global prices because they don't have those costs.
Right, because they basically got the technology for free.
Exactly.
Okay. And there were also some reports from the BBC about Chinese industrial espionage and warnings from the FBI director, Christopher Wray, about China's goal to rob and replicate Western intellectual property.
Right. So this is something that's being taken very seriously by U.S. intelligence agencies.
Okay. So given all of that, what does Rubio suggest that the U.S. should do about it? How do we deal with this situation?
So his proposed response involves a really fundamental shift in how the U.S. approaches its economy and its foreign policy, with a very clear focus on putting American interests first.
Okay.
He argues that any future trade agreements should be judged based on whether they create jobs in America and strengthen American industries.
So no more deals that are good for the global economy, but maybe not so good for American workers.
Yeah, if a deal doesn't benefit American workers and American companies, then we shouldn't be doing it.
Okay, so very much an America First approach.
Yeah, America First, exactly.
Okay, what about foreign policy?
So he suggests that our alliances should favor countries that share American values and that actively contribute to making American industry stronger or to building more secure supply chains among allies.
So it's not just about, like, who's our friend. It's about who's strategically aligned with our interests.
Exactly.
Okay, and he acknowledges that, making these changes isn't going to be easy.
Right, because the people who have benefited from the way things are now, they're going to resist.
Yeah, those big multinational companies we talked about.
Yeah, exactly. They're not going to want to give up their profits.
Okay, and are there any specific policies that have been proposed to kind of move in this America First direction?
So one example is the Patriotic Investment Act, which was proposed by Senators Rubio and Molinar.
Okay.
And this act would basically remove the lower capital gains tax rate for investments in China.
Okay.
So right now, when you invest in something and you make a profit, you pay a lower tax rate on that profit than you do on your regular income.
Right. Capital gains are taxed at a lower rate.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this act would say that if you invest in China, any profits you make from that investment would be taxed at your regular income tax rate.
Oh, okay. So it's like a disincentive to invest in China.
Yeah, it's basically trying to make it less profitable.
To invest in China.
Right, to encourage American investors to pull their money out of China.
Okay, interesting. So kind of hitting them in the wallet a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, but you also mentioned this realist perspective.
Right.
How does that play into all of this?
So the realist perspective basically says that every country is going to act in its own self-interest.
Right.
So while China's actions might be seen as harmful to the U.S., you can also see them as just like normal competition between nations.
Yeah, every country's looking out for number one.
Exactly.
Okay.
So from this perspective, the focus shouldn't be on getting angry at China or blaming China.
Right.
The focus should be on the U.S. figuring out how to be more competitive.
So adapting to the new reality.
Adapting to the new reality, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. And it's not just the U.S. that's noticing all of this.
Right.
I mean, we see reports in the international media as well about concerns over China's growing influence and actions.
Right. There's a growing awareness around the world about this.
Yeah, like Taiwan, for example, has been very vocal about their concerns about China.
Yeah, exactly. And you see this in the news all the time now.
Yeah.
So it's definitely not just an American issue.
Right. Okay. So to kind of wrap all of this up, it seems like the big question is whether the U.S. needs to make some fundamental changes to its approach to China.
I think that's the heart of the debate.
Yeah.
You know, this whole idea that globalization was going to lead to a more peaceful and prosperous world.
Right.
For everyone, it didn't quite work out that way.
Yeah. And China's rise has really kind of thrown a wrench into things.
It has. Yeah. It's changed the game.
And so the U.S. is kind of having to figure out, okay, what's our next move?
Yeah. And I think understanding these dynamics is really important for all of us.
Absolutely.
Because this is going to shape the 21st century.
It's a big story of our time.
Yeah, for sure.
So here's a final thought for you.
Okay.
You know, if we accept this idea that every nation is always going to act in its own self-interest, what does that mean for global cooperation? What does that mean for competition?
That's the big question.
Yeah? Like, can those two things even coexist?
Can we have both?
Right.
Can we have competition and cooperation at the same time?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question to ponder.
It is, yeah. It makes you think.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive.
Oh, God.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
And hey, if you want to see what we get up to when we're not, doing these deep dives, make sure to check out our YouTube channel, Mickytolife.
Yes.
Travel vlogs, maybe a whiskey review or two.
Some chill music.
Some chill background music.
Oh, yep.
Until next time, this has been Joe.
And Sunny.
With the deep dive. Catch you later.
Yeah.